You've opened a box this week, maybe 2, maybe 10. Amazon, Wayfair, a furniture delivery, a restaurant supply, anything on a pallet. You probably never thought about which company moved it, but here's something almost nobody has noticed. 40 years ago, that box would have been carried by one of thousands of competing trucking companies hauling pallet freight across the United States. Today, 5 companies move more than half of every pallet shipment in this country, and the next 25 move almost everything else. 5? That's not deregulation working. That's something else entirely. So how did one law signed on a summer afternoon in 1980 quietly turn an entire competitive industry into a 5-company oligopoly while almost nobody outside trucking even noticed it was happening? The easy answer is the one everyone's heard. Deregulation, free market, the strong survived, except that's wrong. Or more accurately, it's the surface of an answer with 3 deeper layers underneath, and the proof of what really happened is sitting on your front porch this week, baked into the freight cost of nearly everything you've bought this month. But let's start with what everyone gets wrong about deregulation in the first place. Here's the version of the story you've probably heard. President Jimmy Carter signed the Motor Carrier Act on July 1st, 1980. Trucking was deregulated. Rates fell. Competition exploded. The textbook calls this a clean win. And the surface numbers back that up. Truckload shipping rates dropped about 25% in real terms between 1977 and 1982. By 1985, the new law was saving American shippers $7.8 billion every year. By 1998, the real operating cost per truck mile had fallen 75% for full truckload carriers and 35% for less than truckload carriers. The number of trucking companies in America doubled during the 1980s, and trucking employment doubled with it. So if you stop the story there, deregulation looks like exactly what it was sold as. But here's what that explanation misses entirely. American trucking has 2 completely separate halves. There's truckload, fill an entire trailer with one customer's freight and run it from point A to point B. And there's less than truckload, called LTL. Your shipment is too small to fill a trailer alone, so it shares space with dozens of other shippers' pallets, getting sorted at terminals along the route. Truckload after 1980 went exactly the way deregulation was advertised to go. It exploded into a hyper-competitive market with hundreds of thousands of small carriers fighting for every load. But LTL did the opposite. The LTL market got more concentrated, not less. Same law, same year, opposite outcomes. The textbook answer is that LTL needs a network of sorting terminals, and new entrants couldn't easily afford that infrastructure. That's true. It's nowhere near the full story, because the LTL incumbents who already had terminals didn't get richer after 1980. Most of them got destroyed. 3 of the largest, most established names in American trucking went bankrupt in the 4 decades that followed. So whatever was killing the LTL industry, it wasn't a lack of infrastructure. It was something underneath the surface answer, something only deregulation could expose, and something that had been hiding inside trucking law since the year your grandparents were born. Here's the part of trucking history almost nobody outside the industry has heard. The Motor Carrier Act of 1935 was not a regulation. It was, in functional terms, a federally enforced cartel. The mechanism worked like this. The 1935 law required every interstate trucking company to hold a document from the Interstate Commerce Commission called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. Carriers already operating before June 1st, 1935 received their certificates automatically through grandfather rights. Everyone else had to apply, and the ICC was so restrictive in granting new ones that for the next 40 years, from 1940 to 1980, new operating authority was almost impossible to obtain unless no existing carrier opposed your application. Incumbents always opposed. By the 1970s, the right to carry certain goods on certain routes was selling on the secondary market for hundreds of thousands of dollars. A trucking certificate wasn't a license to operate, it was an asset, like a New York taxi medallion before Uber. And this connects to something sitting in your kitchen right now in the freight cost of nearly everything you've bought this month. We'll get to exactly how, but there's a second piece of the cartel most people have never heard of. In 1948, Congress passed the Reed-Bullwinkle Act, which granted both railroads and trucking companies an explicit antitrust exemption. Trucking companies could now legally collude on prices. They were required to file rates collectively through what were called rate bureaus. Independent rate filings by individual carriers were rare to non-existent. The collective rates became the de facto floor of the entire industry. Read that sentence twice. For 45 years, the American trucking industry operated a federally protected price-fixing arrangement. There were thousands of trucking companies before 1980, not because the market wanted thousands. There were thousands because the law forbade competition on price. So, when Carter's pen hit the paper on July 1st, 1980, the Motor Carrier Act didn't deregulate a competitive industry. It exposed a cartel. The new law allowed independent rate filings within a zone of reasonableness. Carriers could now legally cut prices by up to 15% without challenge. Within months, the floor disappeared. The carriers that had been winning for 45 years had been winning a fixed game. When rates suddenly could fall, hundreds of them collapsed within years. More than half of all motor carriers operating in 1980 had exited the industry by 1991. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange. The biggest, most powerful, most unionized carriers, the giants that had dominated American freight for half a century, didn't die in the 1980s. They died on a slow 40-year fuse, and the last one finally went off in 2023. For most of the 20th century, American less-than-truckload trucking was dominated by three companies. They were called the Big Three, and the name was the actual industry term. Yellow Freight, founded in Oklahoma in 1924, Roadway Express, and Consolidated Freightways, known as CF. All three were heavily unionized Teamsters carriers. All three had been quietly protected for decades by the 1935 cartel and the 1948 antitrust exemption. All three were now exposed. The first domino fell in September 2002. Consolidated Freightways collapsed without warning. 20,000 jobs vanished in a single weekend. 14,500 unionized Teamsters and 5,500 non-union workers. At the time, it was one of the largest single-day mass layoffs in American history, and almost no one outside the freight industry remembers it happened. The second domino took longer because Yellow Freight tried to consolidate its way out of the trap. In 2003, Yellow purchased Roadway for nearly $1 billion. Two of the Big Three became one. The merger was supposed to be salvation. Instead, it became a debt machine. Yellow took on roughly $1.5 billion in long-term debt that would compound, restructure, and refinance for the next 20 years without ever fully clearing. The company nearly collapsed in 2008. It nearly collapsed again in 2014. It nearly collapsed in 2019. Then in 2020, with the pandemic crushing freight demand, the federal government gave Yellow a $700 million emergency loan under the CARES Act, justified on the grounds that Yellow moved freight for the Department of Defense. The U.S. Treasury took a 30% equity stake. Yellow's stock collapsed to penny stock territory and never recovered. The third and final domino fell on July 30th, 2023. Yellow Corp ceased operations. On August 6, 2023, it filed for Chapter 11. 30,000 jobs gone, 22,000 of them Teamsters, the largest trucking bankruptcy in American history by every measure. And what filled the void Yellow left points directly to where this lands in your daily life. Yellow had been moving roughly 7% of every LTL pallet shipment in the country on a base of 720,000 daily shipments. Yellow's 128 owned terminals and 25 leased properties were auctioned off for nearly $2 billion. The buyers were almost entirely the surviving LTL carriers. Each one got bigger. Therefore, the picture you should be carrying in your head right now isn't a single bankruptcy in 2023. It's a 43-year consolidation that started on July 1st, 1980 and reached the place where 5 companies move more pallet freight in America than the next several hundred combined. Here's where this lands in your actual life. The total American less than truckload market is projected at roughly $95 billion in 2026. The top 5 carriers, FedEx Freight, Old Dominion Freight Line, XPO Logistics, Estes Express Lines, and Saia, control more than half of that market. The top 25 control 91% of it. FedEx Freight alone moves about $9 billion in revenue a year. Old Dominion moves about $6 billion. They are, in their segment, the freight equivalent of the big 4 banks. Every pallet-sized Amazon order moved through a terminal owned by a small handful of these companies. The freight rate baked into the price of nearly every grocery item in your store. The chicken, the cereal, the bottled water is set inside a market where 5 carriers have structural pricing power. In the months immediately after the Yellow's collapse, LTL rates across the major carriers rose between 4.9 and 7.9%. That increase is now sitting inside the retail price of almost everything that arrived in your store on a pallet. The 22,000 Teamsters jobs that disappeared with Yellow were one of the last large concentrations of unionized middle-class freight work in the country. They are not being recreated. Every furniture delivery, every washer-dryer shipment, every box of construction materials, every pallet of pharmaceuticals, almost all of it now rides through terminals owned by the survivors of a cartel collapse most people have never heard of. So here's where you actually land. You opened a box this week thinking you were just receiving a package. But what you were actually looking at was the residue of a 1935 federal cartel that ran American trucking for 45 years. A 1948 antitrust exemption that let trucking companies legally fix prices. A single deregulation law signed on July 1st, 1980 that pulled the floor out from under all of it. 3 iconic carriers, Yellow, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways that took 43 years to finish dying. The largest trucking bankruptcy in American history in 2023, 22,000 union jobs that quietly disappeared with it, and 5 surviving giants who now sit on top of a $95 billion market that used to belong to thousands. That's not deregulation working as advertised. That's what happens when you strip a price-fixing arrangement that was hiding under a regulatory label, and discover that most of the players in the room only existed because the price was fixed. You're not just looking at a trucking industry. You're looking at the longest, quietest consolidation in modern American business and at the actual price tag stamped onto every box you've ever ordered. And if you think one law reshaped a whole industry quietly, wait until we get into the four-letter federal agency that still decides which highways your packages are legally allowed to drive on and what happens to your delivery costs when it doesn't.